The first time I understood that my family was capable of destroying me, it wasn't during a screaming match or a slammed door. It was in a quiet moment, the kind that settles into your bones and never leaves. 3 days before Christmas, I stood in the hallway of my parents' lakefront house in northern Michigan, my coat still on my hands, numb from the cold. I had driven 6 hours straight after work, skipping dinner, rehearsing apologies in my head I didn't owe anyone. I was 29 years old and still felt like a child begging to be allowed back inside. Through the cracked door of the den, I heard my mother laugh. "She'll understand eventually," she said. "She always does." My sister's voice followed, light and sharp. "And if she doesn't, that's not our problem." There was a pause. Then my father spoke, calm and final. "We're not changing the will." I froze. The air smelled like pine and cinnamon, the same holiday candles my mother had lit every year since I could remember. My heart thudded so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. I leaned my forehead against the wall, careful not to breathe too loudly. My name hadn't been said yet, but I knew. In that house, silence had always meant me. I waited for someone to say I mattered. I waited for my father to clear his throat and add, "Of course we'll take care of her too." I waited for my mother to soften the way she did for everyone except me. None of that happened. Instead, my sister said, "It makes sense. I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who cares about the family business." My father hummed in agreement. "You've always understood responsibility." I pressed my hand to my mouth as something inside me went cold and clear. They weren't arguing. They weren't conflicted. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a decision. I stepped back quietly, my boots soundless against the hardwood floors. No one noticed me leave. They never did. That night, I slept in my old bedroom, the one my parents never bothered to update. The walls were still pale yellow, the color my mother had chosen when I was 14, before my sister decided yellow was childish. My sister's room down the hall had been renovated twice since then. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to laughter drift up from downstairs. Glasses clinked. Christmas music played softly. My family was whole without me, and I was finally old enough to see it. I had spent my entire life trying to earn something that was never meant for me. Growing up, the favoritism wasn't loud. It was subtle, polite, dressed up as practicality. My sister Claire was the one with the bright future, the one my parents introduced proudly at dinner parties, the one whose mistakes were explained away as passion while mine were treated as proof of failure. At Thanksgiving, she sat beside my father at the head of the table, carving the turkey like a ritual. I passed dishes and refilled drinks. On birthdays, her parties filled the house with friends and noise. Mine were quiet, often rescheduled, sometimes forgotten altogether. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was independent, strong, different. But standing in that hallway, hearing them plan a future where I didn't exist, something finally broke open. The next morning, Christmas Eve, I came downstairs dressed neatly, hair pulled back, face calm. My mother smiled when she saw me, the same polite smile she used on neighbors. "There you are," she said, "coffee's on the counter." No hug, no apology for the night before. Of course not. Apologies require acknowledgement. My sister breezed in moments later, wrapped in a cashmere sweater I recognized instantly. It was the same brand I'd shown my mother months ago, joking that it was too expensive for me to ever buy for myself. Claire caught my eye and smiled, sweet and sharp. "You made it," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," I replied. She tilted her head. "You always do." Breakfast was quiet. My father read the paper. My mother fussed with place settings. No one mentioned the will. No one mentioned the future. They talked about weather, neighbors, holiday traffic. When my mother finally spoke my name, it was like an afterthought. "Oh, by the way," she said lightly, "we're having dinner with the Thompsons tonight. Claire will be joining us." I waited. "You're welcome to come too," she added, already turning back to the stove. "If you want." If I want. I looked at my reflection in the microwave door. I looked older than I felt, tired, smaller somehow. "I actually have plans," I said. My mother nodded, unsurprised. "Of course." Claire glanced up, curiosity flickering briefly. "Plans?" "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze. "With myself." She laughed. "That sounds about right." I left the house before noon, driving south with the radio off. Snow fell softly, covering the road, in white erasing lines and directions. For the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt awake. Back in my small apartment, I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open but untouched. Outside, families moved between cars carrying wrapped gifts and laughter. I watched from a distance like I always had. I thought about the will again, about how easily they had erased me, and then I thought about everything they didn't know. They didn't know about the promotion I'd turned down, so I could stay close enough to help them when my mother was sick. They didn't know about the savings account I'd quietly built. They didn't know about the offer sitting in my inbox from a firm in Chicago or the lawyer I'd consulted after my father casually added my sister's name to the family company accounts. They thought I was harmless, convenient, excludable. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in years. My grandmother's old friend, Margaret Lowell, retired attorney, sharp as glass. When she answered, her voice was warm but alert. "Hello, Margaret," I said. "It's me. I need to ask you something." There was a pause. "Then are you finally ready?" I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said, "I think I am." Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet and relentless. Inside, something old and patient began to move. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know who would fall or how badly it would hurt. But for the first time in my life, I understood one thing clearly. I had been excluded on purpose, and I was done pretending it didn't matter. The offer from Chicago sat unopened in my inbox for 2 days. I knew it was there. I felt it like a pulse under my skin, persistent, impossible to ignore. But opening it felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. That staying close to my family had never been loyalty. It had been fear. On the third morning after Christmas, I finally clicked it open. Senior Operations Director. Full relocation package. Salary that made my breath catch. A chance to build something that belonged to me in a city where no one knew my last name or my sister's face. I closed the laptop slowly and stared out the window. The parking lot was nearly empty. Everyone else was still with their families, still wrapped in traditions that smelled like cinnamon and denial. I thought about my parents' house again, about the way my mother had said, "If you want," like I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. About my father's voice, steady and final, saying they weren't changing the will. That was when I realized something that made my chest tighten. They hadn't just excluded me from their future. They'd been preparing for it for years. I thought back to the small things I'd brushed off. The paperwork my father insisted on handling alone. The company meetings I was never invited to, even though I worked in finance and operations professionally. The way my sister's name began appearing next to his on accounts that used to list only him. At the time, I'd told myself it was easier that way, less drama, less conflict. But ease had cost me everything. I picked up my phone and called Margaret back. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me what happened," she said. So I did. I told her about the hallway, the will, the way my sister had spoken as if I were already gone. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "They've been counting on your silence," she said. "People like that always do." "I don't want revenge," I said automatically. She chuckled softly. "No one ever does. They want fairness, justice. Revenge is just the word people use when women stop accepting crumbs." That landed harder than I expected. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted. "You start by learning the truth," she replied, "and by protecting yourself." That afternoon, she sent me a list. Bank statements to request, public filings to review, questions I hadn't known to ask before. I worked through them methodically the way I always did, one document at a time, one fact stacked on top of another. By evening, my hands were trembling. My father had moved assets months ago. Quietly. Legally, but strategically. The family business, once divided evenly between future heirs in theory, had been restructured. Claire's name appeared everywhere, mine nowhere. There was even a trust I hadn't known existed. A trust that listed me not as a beneficiary but as a contingent dependent. In plain English, it meant this: if something happened to my parents, Claire would inherit control. I would receive limited support at her discretion. Support, like an allowance. I laughed out loud, sharp and bitter, alone in my kitchen. I thought about all the years I'd defended them to friends. All the times I'd said they mean well or they don't realize how it sounds. They realized. They just didn't care. That night, I dreamed of my childhood home. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors closing one by one as I walked past. No matter how fast I moved, I was always too late. I woke before dawn, heart racing. Instead of trying to sleep again, I got dressed and went for a walk. The city was quiet, wrapped in gray winter light. I walked until my legs burned, until the anger settled into something steadier. Resolve. By the time I returned, I knew what I had to do. First, I called my brother. Evan had moved out west years ago and kept his distance from the family. At the time, I thought he was selfish. Now I wondered if he'd simply seen the truth before I did. He answered on the third ring. "This is unexpected," he said. "Everything okay?" "No," I replied. "But I think it's about to be." There was a pause. What happened? When I told him, he didn't sound surprised. "They did the same thing to me," he said quietly. "Different method, same outcome." I stopped walking in the middle of the sidewalk. "You never told me." "I didn't want to poison your hope," he said. "You still believed things could be fixed." I closed my eyes. "They can't," I said. "No," he agreed. "They can't." We talked for an hour. About childhood. About the unspoken rules. About the way Claire learned early how to play their approval like a violin. When we hung up, I felt lighter. Not because the truth hurt less, but because I wasn't alone in it anymore. The next call I made was harder. My sister. She answered brightly as if nothing had happened. "Hey," she said. "Back home already?" "Yes," I said. "I heard you've been busy." There was a pause just long enough. "What do you mean?" "The trust," I said. "The company restructuring. The will." Silence stretched between us. Finally, she sighed. "You weren't supposed to hear it like that. Like what I asked, like the truth." "You're overreacting," she said quickly. "This is about stability, about the family legacy." "And where do I fit into that?" I asked. She hesitated. "You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." There it was, the line they all used, the justification for cutting me out. I felt something settle inside me then, cold, clear. "I'm glad you believe that," I said, "because I'm going to prove it." She laughed lightly. "You're being dramatic." Maybe, I replied, but I'm also done. I hung up before she could respond. That night I opened the Chicago offer again. This time I read every word carefully. The relocation timeline, the responsibilities, the expectations. At the bottom was a simple sentence. "We believe you are exactly what we need." I stared at it for a long time. No qualifiers, no conditions, no comparison to anyone else. Just me. I signed the acceptance and sent it back. The confirmation came within minutes. As I closed my laptop, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Your father and I would like to talk when you have time." I smiled to myself, slow and deliberate. They were late. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. I was walking away with my dignity intact. And I had the feeling deep in my bones that this wasn't an ending. It was the first move. I didn't tell my parents about Chicago. Not right away. There was a time in my life when I would have announced it carefully, politely, like a child asking permission. I would have explained the salary, the title, the logic. I would have tried to make it sound reasonable enough that they couldn't dismiss it. That instinct was still there, hovering. But I didn't listen to it anymore. Instead, I focused on preparing. I gave notice at my job, the same office where I'd been passed over twice for promotion because I was reliable where I was. My manager blinked in surprise when I told him I was leaving. "Didn't see that coming," he said. "We always thought you'd stay." "I used to think so too," I replied. He asked where I was going. When I told him, his eyebrows rose. "Good for you," he said, sounding almost sheepish. "They're lucky to have you." It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Validation hits differently when it comes from people who don't owe you anything. At night, I packed slowly. I sorted through years of quiet compromises disguised as practicality. Clothes I wore to blend in, old files I'd kept just in case, a shoebox of birthday cards from my grandmother, the only one who ever wrote me letters instead of quick texts. I found photos too. Claire at graduation, flanked by my parents, all smiles, me cropped at the edge of the frame, me again holding a cake alone while everyone else leaned toward her. I didn't cry. I felt something steadier than sadness now, something like clarity. 2 weeks later, my mother called again. This time I answered. "We're worried about you," she said immediately. I almost laughed. "Why?" I asked. "You've been distant," she replied. "Your father thinks you're upset." "Is he wrong?" I asked. She sighed the way she always did when conversation drifted toward discomfort. "We didn't mean to hurt you." "You meant to exclude me," I said calmly. "That's different." There was silence. I could picture her sitting at the kitchen table, phone tucked between shoulder and ear, eyes darting toward the doorway in case my father overheard. "You're being unfair," she said finally. "No," I replied, "I'm being accurate." I told her about Chicago then. Not to boast, not to provoke, just as a statement of fact. She didn't congratulate me. Instead, she asked, "When were you going to tell us?" "When it mattered," I said. Another pause. "This feels sudden." "It's been building for years," I said. "You just weren't looking." When we hung up, my hands were steady. That surprised me. The night before I left, Evan called. "They know," he said. I assumed, I replied. Dad's angry, he added. Claire's panicking. That caught my attention. Why? She thought you'd fade, he said, not leave. I smiled small and private. Chicago was colder than I expected. Wind whipped between buildings, sharp and unapologetic. I loved it instantly. My new apartment was small but bright, the windows facing a street that buzzed with movement and possibility. No memories lived there yet. No ghosts. On my first day, I wore a navy coat and walked into the office with my shoulders back. No one knew my history. No one cared who my sister was. They cared what I could do, and I delivered. Weeks passed, then months. I built systems, streamlined operations, fixed inefficiencies no one else had noticed because they were too used to working around them. My team trusted me quickly. Respect came easily when it wasn't withheld as leverage. One afternoon, as I was leaving a meeting, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I didn't answer. The voicemail came minutes later. Hi, Claire's voice said, strained but composed. It's me, we need to talk. I listened to it twice before deleting it. The second message came a week later, then another. The tone shifted each time. First annoyed, then conciliatory, finally nervous. I ignored them all. Then Evan called. They're selling, he said. I stopped mid-step in the middle of a crosswalk. Selling what? The company, he replied, or trying to. My heart kicked hard. Why? Cash flow issues, he said. Bad decisions. Claire pushed too hard. Dad covered for her until he couldn't. I closed my eyes as the light changed around me. And the trust, I asked. Still stands, Evan said. But it won't matter if there's nothing left. I leaned against a building, the cold brick grounding me. They want something from me, I said. Evan exhaled. They always do. The next call came from my father. His voice sounded older, tired. We made mistakes, he said without preamble. I didn't respond. We're family, he continued. That has to mean something. It did, I said, once. He cleared his throat. We could use your expertise. Just to advise, temporarily. There it was. Not an apology, not accountability, a request. I don't work for free, I said. He bristled. This isn't about money. It always was, I replied. You just didn't think I'd notice. I hung up before he could answer. That night, I sat in my apartment with the city humming outside and realized something profound. Leaving had shifted the balance. They no longer controlled the narrative. They no longer decided my value. And for the first time, they were afraid of losing something they thought they owned. Me. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know how ugly it would get. But I knew one thing with certainty. They had underestimated what happens when the invisible daughter stops being available. And that mistake would cost them far more than they imagined. The first time my parents showed up in Chicago, they didn't tell me they were coming. I found out because the receptionist on my floor sent me a polite message asking if I was expecting visitors. 2 people, middle-aged, insisted they were family. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. For a moment, my chest tightened the way it used to, that old reflex to prepare myself to be small. Then I stood, smoothed my blazer, and walked toward the elevator like I belonged exactly where I was. Because I did. They were waiting in the lobby, my mother clutching her purse like a shield, my father standing stiffly beside her. They looked out of place under the glass ceiling and steel beams, smaller somehow, less certain. My mother's face brightened when she saw me. There you are, she said, relief flooding her voice. We were worried they wouldn't let us up. They don't, I said evenly. This isn't a family space. My father's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Can we talk? I glanced at my watch. You have 10 minutes. We sat in a quiet cafe across the street. Neutral ground. No home field advantage for anyone. My mother went first as always. You look well, she said. Chicago suits you. Thank you, I replied. My father cleared his throat. We didn't come to fight. I met his eyes, then don't. Silence stretched. Cups clinked. A woman at the next table laughed into her phone. Finally, my mother leaned forward. We're in a difficult position. I waited. The company is under pressure, she continued. Your father's health isn't what it used to be. Claire is overwhelmed. I sipped my coffee, and we thought my father said carefully that you might be willing to help. Advise. Consult. You understand operations better than anyone. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. They hadn't come to apologize. They hadn't come to repair anything. They had come because they needed me. I already have a job, I said. This wouldn't interfere, my mother said quickly. Just temporary, until things stabilize. Under what authority, I asked. They exchanged a glance. Well, my father said informally. Claire would remain in charge, of course. Of course. And what happens after, I asked. When things are stable again, my mother smiled tentative. We'll see. I leaned back in my chair. For years, I said calmly, you told me I wasn't driven enough, not ambitious enough, not right for the business. That's not what we meant, my father said. It's exactly what you did, I replied. And now you want my competence without my presence? My labor without my voice? My mother's eyes filled. You're being harsh. No, I said, I'm being honest. My father's tone hardened. Family doesn't keep score. I laughed softly. Family kept score the entire time. I just wasn't allowed to see the numbers. They left shortly after that. My mother hugged me awkwardly on the sidewalk as if hoping physical closeness might replace accountability. It didn't. That night Claire called again. This time I answered. Her voice was tight, brittle. Did they talk to you? Yes, I said. And she asked. And nothing, I replied. She exhaled sharply. You could help, you know that. I do, I said. I choose not to. Her patience cracked. You're punishing us. I'm protecting myself, I replied. You always do this, she snapped. You take things personally. I felt something old flare, but it didn't control me anymore. You took my future personally, I said. You just called it business. Silence. Then quieter. If this falls apart, it affects all of us. I thought of the trust, the will, the hallway in Michigan. No, I said, it affects you. I hung up. The next week, Evan flew in. We sat on my couch, shoes off, pizza boxes open between us like we were teenagers again. They're desperate, he said. Dad's pride is cracked. Claire's confidence is unraveling. I nodded. Good. He studied me carefully. You're sure about this? Yes, I said, but I'm not done. That caught his attention. I'm not helping them for free, I continued, and I'm not stepping back into a system designed to erase me. What are you thinking, he asked. I took a breath. I'm thinking of leverage, I said. I'd learned something in the months since I left. Power doesn't come from yelling or confrontation. It comes from timing, from information, from knowing when to stay silent and when to speak. Margaret confirmed it when I called her the next day. They want your expertise without accountability, she said. Classic. So I give it to them, I replied, on my terms. She hummed thoughtfully. Consulting agreement, written, clear authority, transparent compensation. And conditions, I added. Especially conditions, she agreed. By the end of the week, I had a draft. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't vindictive. It was fair. I would consult for a limited period. I would have access to full financial records. I would be compensated at market rate. And most importantly, my recommendations would be binding. No more advisory roles, no more quiet contributions erased from credit. When I sent it to my father, his reply came hours later. This feels excessive. I responded immediately. So did excluding me from the will. There was no answer after that. 3 days passed. Then Claire called. Her voice was stripped of its sharpness now. We'll agree, she said. I closed my eyes. There's one more thing, I added. She sighed. What? I want my name added back, I said. Not as a favor, as recognition, in writing. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her voice was flat. You're serious? I always was, I replied. That night, as I stood by my window watching the city pulse below, I felt something shift again. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. They had built a future without me. Now they would learn what it cost to ask the excluded daughter to save it. They signed the agreement on a Tuesday. No ceremony, no apology, just scanned documents in my inbox, each page bearing signatures that felt heavier than ink. When I opened the final file and saw my name listed with authority, not as an afterthought, something in my chest tightened. Not relief. Recognition. I read every line twice, then a third time. Margaret had trained me well. When I replied with my confirmation, I kept it brief. I will begin Monday. No smiley faces, no softening language, just clarity. By Friday, I had a temporary office in the building that once made me feel small. The same family company logo hung in the lobby, polished and familiar, but the air felt different now. Or maybe I was. Claire met me outside the elevator, arms crossed, posture defensive. You didn't have to come in person, she said. Yes, I replied calmly, I did. Her eyes flicked to the nameplate on my door. Consultant Operations and Strategy. My name underneath. She swallowed. Inside, the numbers told a story no one wanted to say out loud. Cash reserves drained faster than reported. Vendor contracts renegotiated badly. Loans stacked to cover mistakes instead of fixing them. Claire's expansion plans were bleeding the company quietly, efficiently. I worked late that first week. Not to prove anything. Not to impress. Because I'm thorough. My father avoided my office. My mother hovered, offering coffee I didn't accept. The staff watched closely, unsure how to recalibrate now that the invisible daughter had a door and a title. On Thursday afternoon, I called a meeting. When everyone was seated, I stood and laid out the facts. No raised voice, no accusation, just numbers. This is where we are, I said. This is where we're going, if nothing changes. The room was silent. Claire shifted in her chair. That projection assumes worst-case scenarios. No, I replied, it assumes reality. My father cleared his throat. What do you recommend? I met his gaze evenly. Immediate restructuring, cost controls, and stepping back from projects we can't sustain. Claire's jaw clenched. Those are my initiatives. They're unsustainable, I said. This isn't personal. She laughed sharply. It always is with you. I didn't react. That unsettled her more than anger ever could. By the end of the meeting, they agreed to my first set of recommendations. The second week, resistance grew. Emails went unanswered. Data arrived late. Meetings were rescheduled without me. Subtle sabotage dressed up as oversight. I documented everything. Margaret's voice echoed in my head. If you're going to stand in the fire, bring proof. One evening, as I was packing up, my mother appeared in the doorway. You don't have to be so cold, she said quietly. I looked at her. Really looked. I'm not cold, I replied. I'm careful. She sighed. We raised you better than this. I almost smiled. You raised me to survive, I said. This is what that looks like. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. Claire called an emergency board meeting without me. I found out because Evan texted. They're trying to override you. I arrived 10 minutes late on purpose. When I walked in, the room stilled. Claire was mid-sentence outlining a plan that directly contradicted my recommendations. I'm glad I caught this, I said lightly. She stiffened. We're discussing internal matters. So am I replied, sliding a folder onto the table. Inside were printed emails, delayed reports, revised numbers that didn't match original filings. This meeting violates the agreement, I said calmly, and so does this. My father's face darkened. Claire. She flushed. I was just trying to move things forward. By hiding information, I asked. That's not leadership, that's panic. The room shifted. Board members exchanged looks. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. This is your warning, I continued. We do this transparently or I walk. And when I walk, I take my findings with me. Silence fell thick and absolute. My father swallowed. That won't be necessary. I nodded. Good. After the meeting, Claire confronted me in the hallway. You think you've won? She hissed. I met her gaze steadily. No, I think you're learning. She scoffed. You've always wanted this. I shook my head. I wanted fairness. This is just the cost of avoiding it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment's city lights flickering like distant stars. I felt tired, but not broken. Because something had shifted again. They were no longer pretending I was expendable. They were afraid of what would happen if I left. And that fear, that was the leverage they'd never expected me to hold. The real revenge, I realized, wasn't humiliation or punishment. It was making them confront the consequences of believing I would always accept less. And this was only the beginning. By the third month, the company was breathing again. Not thriving, not celebrating, but stable enough that the panic had dulled into resentment. That was when the tone changed. My father stopped asking for my input in meetings and started phrasing things as if the decisions were already made. My mother became careful with her words, rehearsed like someone navigating thin ice. Claire oscillated between icy silence and forced politeness. They were waiting for me to overstep. I knew the pattern well. In our family, power was tolerated only when it remained invisible. The moment it became undeniable, it had to be corrected. The test came on a Friday afternoon. I was reviewing vendor contracts when my assistant knocked softly on the door. Her face was tight. There's a memo circulating, she said, about restructuring leadership roles. I didn't need to read it to know. Still, I took the paper. Proposed interim adjustments. My role reduced from consultant with binding authority to advisory support. No explanation, no discussion, just an assumption. I folded the memo neatly and placed it on my desk. Thank you, I said. Please let me know when the board is assembled. She hesitated. They're meeting now. Of course they were. I walked into the boardroom without knocking. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. My father's face hardened. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't on the agenda, my father said. It involves me, I replied. So it is now. I laid the memo on the table. This violates our agreement, I said calmly. Again. My father sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. We can't have the company run by an outsider. The word outsider landed with precision. I was never outside, I said. You pushed me there. Claire scoffed. Don't dramatize. I met her gaze. You tried to strip my authority quietly. That's not drama. That's strategy. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. This does feel abrupt. It's necessary, my father said. Stability requires clear hierarchy. I nodded slowly. Then let's be clear. I reached into my folder and slid out a second document. My resignation. Gasps rippled around the table. This is effective immediately, I said. Per clause 7 subsection 3. You'll find it in the agreement you signed. Claire's face went pale. You're bluffing. I smiled slightly. I don't bluff. My father stood. You can't do this. I already have, I replied. Silence crashed over the room. You need me, my mother said softly, panic creeping into her voice. No, I corrected gently. You needed control. I gathered my things and left without another word. I expected the calls to start immediately. They didn't. That worried me more than shouting ever could. 3 days passed, then 5. No messages, no emails, no threats. On the 6th day, Evan called. They're spiraling, he said, and they're blaming you. I laughed quietly. Of course they are. They're telling people you sabotaged them, he continued. That you walked out at the worst possible moment. Did you correct them, I asked. I told them the truth, he said. They didn't listen. Good, I replied. Let them talk. Because here's what they didn't understand. I had documented everything, every decision, every memo, every attempt to undermine my authority. Margaret had already prepared the next step. When the first article appeared in the local business journal, it was careful but pointed. Sources indicate internal power struggles and governance issues at the family firm following controversial leadership decisions. No names, no accusations, just enough light. The second article followed a week later. This one mentioned restructuring efforts undermined by internal resistance. By the third, investors were asking questions. That was when my father called. His voice was hoarse. We need to fix this. I leaned back in my chair, phone balanced easily in my hand. You had your chance, I said. We can renegotiate, he said quickly. Better terms. No, I replied, I don't work where I'm erased. There was a long silence. What do you want, he asked finally. I closed my eyes. I want you to stop lying about me, I said. Publicly. Another pause. Then quietly, and if we don't, then I tell the truth, I replied. The line went dead. That night I slept deeply for the first time in months. Because I finally understood something they were only beginning to grasp. Power isn't about who stays. It's about who can leave and still stand tall. And once they saw I could walk away without falling apart, everything they thought they controlled started to crumble. The apology came in pieces. Not all at once, not clean. It arrived in fragments scattered across phone calls, forwarded emails, and carefully worded statements that tried very hard to sound like accountability without actually being it. My father went first. He called late one night after 10 when exhaustion makes people careless. We didn't mean to erase you, he said. Things just evolved. I stared at the dark ceiling above my bed, listening to the hum of the city outside. Evolved how I asked. He hesitated. Responsibility fell where it made sense. That's not an answer, I said. He exhaled sharply. You left. Claire stayed. I closed my eyes. No, I said. I stayed for years. You just didn't see me. Silence. Then his voice brittle with irritation. You always twist things. I ended the call. The next day, my mother tried a different approach. She sent an email. Long, emotional, full of words like misunderstandings, family wounds, unintended consequences. She wrote about my childhood, about sacrifices, about how hard parenting had been. She didn't mention the will, or the trust, or the memo that stripped my authority. She didn't mention choice. I didn't reply. By the end of the week, Claire broke. She showed up at my apartment unannounced. I knew it was her the moment I opened the door. She smelled like expensive perfume and panic. You can't just disappear, she snapped, pushing past me into the living room. I didn't, I said. I left. She spun to face me. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, I replied calmly. I told the truth. She laughed sharp and unhinged. You burned everything. I tilted my head. No, I stopped putting out fires you kept starting. Her composure cracked. You always think you're better, she said, voice rising. Smarter, more principled. No, I said. I think I'm done pretending. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. Dad's health is failing, she said suddenly. Mom's a mess. Investors are pulling back. I crossed my arms. That's unfortunate. Her eyes widened. That's all you have to say? Yes. She shook her head slowly. You really don't care anymore. I met her gaze steadily. I care about myself now. That was the moment the mask slipped. Not hers. Mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to soften my words. I didn't apologize for my boundaries. I didn't explain my pain in a way that made it easier for her to dismiss. And she couldn't stand it. You think this makes you powerful? She sneered. You think walking away makes you righteous? No, I said. It makes me free. She laughed again, but it sounded hollow. You'll regret this. Maybe, I replied, but not for the reasons you think. She left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I sat down slowly, my hands shaking just a little. Not from fear, from release. Later that night, Evan called. She came to you, he said. Yes. She's unraveling, he added. So are they. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. They've started telling people you were unstable, he continued. That you acted emotionally. I smiled to myself. Of course they did. They're trying to control the narrative, he said. Again. Let them, I replied. Because this time I was ready. Margaret had warned me this would happen. When people lose control, she'd said they attack credibility, especially women's. We prepared quietly. I gathered documentation. Emails, agreements, financials, timelines. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize. I organized. When the board requested an independent review, I complied fully. When an investor reached out privately, I answered calmly, factually. No insults, no emotional language, just the truth. And the truth delivered without apology was devastating. By the end of the month, my father stepped down as interim chair. Claire was placed under review. The company issued a public statement acknowledging internal governance failures and restructuring leadership. My name was mentioned once, as the consultant whose recommendations had been disregarded. I didn't celebrate. I sat in my apartment with the windows open, city air drifting in, and let myself feel the weight of it. Grief still lived there. Grief for the family I'd wanted. Grief for the version of myself who kept hoping. But something else lived there too now. Respect. Not from them. From me. That night I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her shoulders were squared, her eyes steady. She wasn't louder or crueler or harder. She was clearer. I thought about how long it had taken me to understand this truth. Revenge isn't always about taking something away. Sometimes it's about refusing to give yourself back. And once I stopped offering my silence as a peace treaty, the entire structure they'd built on my compliance collapsed. They had mistaken my patience for permission, and that mistake had finally caught up with them. I didn't know yet what the fallout would look like, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They could never unsee who I was now, and neither could I. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something collapses, and everyone is still standing there staring at the rubble, pretending it was always supposed to look that way. I felt it most in the mornings. No frantic emails, no late-night calls, no careful manipulation disguised as concern. My phone stayed still on the nightstand, and for the first time that stillness didn't make me anxious. It made me alert, because I knew my family well enough to understand this wasn't acceptance. It was regrouping. The first sign came from an unexpected place: human resources. I received an email requesting a formal statement regarding my time as a consultant framed as a routine internal review. The language was neutral, but the timing wasn't. They were building a file. I forwarded it to Margaret without comment. Her reply came back within minutes. They're preparing to protect themselves. That means they're scared. Good, I thought. I drafted my response carefully. Factual, documented, measured. Every sentence anchored to dates, agreements, and written communication. No opinions, no emotional language. When I hit send, I felt the same calm I'd felt walking out of the boardroom weeks earlier. Control doesn't come from volume. It comes from preparation. That afternoon, Evan called again. They're talking about suing, he said quietly. I didn't react. For what? Breach of loyalty? Damage to reputation, that kind of thing. I smiled to myself. And what evidence do they have? None, he admitted. But Claire's convinced she can intimidate you into backing down. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the street below. People moved with purpose, unaware of the family war that had once consumed my entire world. She still thinks I'm afraid, I said. That's the problem, Evan replied. So does Dad. The lawsuit threat never materialized. Margaret shut it down before it could breathe. She sent a single letter, polite, precise, lethal. It outlined their contractual violations, documented attempts to strip my authority, and reminded them gently that defamation works both ways. After that, the tone shifted again. This time it was desperation. My mother left a voicemail that sounded like she'd been crying. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said. We're family. You don't treat family like enemies. I listened to it once, then deleted it. Because what she really meant was you don't stop playing your assigned role. And I had. 2 weeks later, the real consequences began to surface. The company's largest client announced they were reevaluating their partnership pending leadership stability. A regional bank tightened lending terms. The press started asking sharper questions. None of it was my doing, and all of it was my fault according to them. Claire tried calling again. I didn't answer. She emailed instead. We need to talk. This has gone too far. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. Too far for whom? That night I met Margaret for dinner. She studied me over her glass of wine. You're holding up better than most people do at this stage. This stage, I asked? She smiled faintly. When the people who benefited from your silence start blaming you for the noise. I nodded. I feel steady. That's because you're not trying to be understood, she said. You're trying to be honest. The next morning I received a message that made my hands go cold. It was from a junior analyst at the company, someone I barely knew. I thought you should see this. Attached was a forwarded email chain. Claire had instructed staff to withhold certain documents during the internal review. She framed it as protecting the family and avoiding unnecessary exposure. My name appeared once in the thread. We can't let her narrative stand. I stared at the screen for a long time, not angry. Clear. I forwarded the email to Margaret and Evan. Then I waited. The fallout was swift. An independent auditor was brought in. Claire was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. My father released a statement stepping back permanently for health reasons. My mother stopped calling. For the first time since childhood, there was no one left trying to manage me. And that was when the grief finally hit. Not all at once, in waves. I cried in the shower, in the car, in the quiet moments between tasks. I cried for the holidays that would never feel the same, for the parents I'd hoped would choose me, for the sister I'd never truly had. I didn't cry because I'd lost them. I cried because I'd finally stopped lying to myself about who they were. One evening, Evan came over with takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on the floor like we used to when we were younger, backs against the couch. Do you ever wish it had gone differently? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Yes, I said, but not at the cost of who I became. He nodded. I think you scared them. I think they were always scared, I replied. I just stopped making myself smaller to reassure them. The following week, I received a formal notice. The board requested my testimony during the review. Not as an accused party, as a witness. I agreed. When I walked into the conference room, I felt something close to peace. I answered their questions honestly. I presented documentation. I didn't speculate. I didn't editorialize. When it was over, one of the board members thanked me. You handled this with integrity, she said. I met her eyes. I handled it with truth. Outside, the city buzzed as usual. Life hadn't paused for my family's reckoning, and neither had I. That night, alone in my apartment, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for vindication, not for them to understand. The revenge I'd imagined years ago, dramatic and explosive, felt childish now. This was quieter, deeper. They had tried to erase me. Instead, they had revealed themselves. And in doing so, they gave me something far more valuable than inheritance or approval. They gave me my life back. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because when people lose power they never deserved, they rarely accept it gracefully. And the final reckoning was still coming. The subpoena arrived on a Thursday morning. Not dramatic. Not delivered by anyone in a suit knocking on my door. Just an envelope mixed in with junk mail and grocery coupons sitting quietly in my mailbox like it belonged there. I knew immediately what it was. I stood in the hallway of my building, winter coat still on, reading it twice to be sure. Claire was contesting the internal findings. She was claiming misconduct, manipulation, undue influence. By me, I laughed once, short and breathless, startling an elderly neighbor who smiled politely and hurried past. So this was their last move. If they couldn't control the truth, they would rewrite it. I called Margaret before I even took my coat off. She finally pulled the trigger, I said. Margaret's voice was calm, almost amused. I was wondering how long she'd hold out. She's claiming I engineered the audit, I continued. That I destabilized the company on purpose. Margaret chuckled softly. Of course she is. That's the only story where she isn't responsible. Do we fight? I asked. We don't fight, she replied. We respond. The hearing was scheduled for early spring, civil, public record, no jury, just a panel, documents, and testimony. Claire wanted her version preserved. She didn't realize what that meant for mine. In the weeks leading up to it, my mother resurfaced. Not with accusations, with nostalgia. She sent photos. Old holiday snapshots, birthday cakes. Me and Claire as children, arms around each other, smiling before the damage became deliberate. Remember when things were simple? I stared at the message for a long time. Things were never simple, I typed back. They were just quieter. She didn't reply. Evan flew in the week before the hearing. We sat at my kitchen table again, papers spread out between us like a second career. She's leaning hard on emotion, he said, scanning a summary Margaret had prepared, painting herself as overwhelmed, pushed. By me, I said. By expectations, he corrected gently. She's careful not to sound cruel. I nodded. She never does, she lets others fill in the blanks. That had always been her skill. Margaret prepared me well. We rehearsed questions, not answers, questions. Because in these settings, credibility doesn't come from how much you say. It comes from how little you need to. The morning of the hearing, I wore a simple navy dress and low heels. Nothing dramatic, nothing soft. Neutral. I didn't look at Claire when I walked in, but I felt her eyes on me, sharp, searching. My parents sat behind her. That was the hardest part, not seeing them, seeing how small they look now. The panel opened with procedural language, boring, necessary. Then Claire spoke. She described years of pressure, of responsibility she hadn't asked for, of a sister who resented her success and inserted herself at a vulnerable moment. She spoke well, controlled, emotional in the right places. She cried once. My mother dabbed her eyes. When it was my turn, the room felt different, not tense, attentive. I answered questions simply. Yes, I was hired as a consultant. Yes, my authority was documented. Yes, attempts were made to override that authority. No, I did not initiate the audit. I paused only once. When asked why I had walked away instead of negotiating. Because my presence was being used without my consent, I said. And because staying would have required me to accept being diminished. One of the panelists leaned forward. Diminished how? I took a breath. By being asked to fix problems I was not allowed to name, I said. By being held responsible without being respected. The room was quiet. Margaret submitted the emails, the memos, the timeline. Claire shifted in her chair. The final blow came from someone none of us expected. My father. He requested to speak. My heart pounded as he stood, hands shaking slightly. He didn't look at me. He looked at the panel. I created this, he said hoarsely. The imbalance, the favoritism. My mother gasped softly. I thought I was protecting the company, he continued. But I was protecting my own comfort. And I let one daughter carry weight while denying the other dignity. The room held its breath. Claire whispered, Dad. He didn't stop. She didn't sabotage us, he said. She told the truth, and we didn't like hearing it. I felt tears sting my eyes, not because of relief, because of timing. He hadn't spoken when it mattered most, but he was speaking now. The panel recessed briefly. When they returned, the decision was concise. Claire's claims were dismissed. The findings stood. No misconduct on my part. Claire didn't look at me as people filed out. My mother followed my father out silently. Evan squeezed my hand. You okay? He asked. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said, I am. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps and felt something settle. Not triumph, closure. They had tried to rewrite history. Instead, they recorded it accurately for the first time. And that mattered. Not because they lost, but because I no longer had to carry their version of events inside me. I walked away without looking back, because the final chapter wasn't about what they lost. It was about what I refused to lose ever again. Winning doesn't feel the way people think it does. There was no rush of triumph when the decision came down. No urge to call anyone. No fantasy of rubbing the truth in their faces. What I felt instead was something quieter, heavier. After the adrenaline fades. After the fight is over. After the story everyone watched has reached a conclusion, but your life still has to continue. The week following the hearing was strangely empty. No court dates. No strategy calls. No late-night preparation. I woke up on Monday expecting urgency to greet me, and instead there was just sunlight through the blinds and the hum of the city waking up. For the first time in months, no one needed anything from me. That realization was both comforting and unsettling. At work, my team congratulated me in small ways. A nod here, a glad it's over there. No one pried, no one asked for details. They respected the boundary I hadn't even realized I'd built. And that more than anything felt like a gift. Midweek, I received an email from the board. They wanted to discuss a permanent role, not with my family's company, with one of their partners, an independent firm that had followed the review closely and admired my professionalism under pressure. I read the message twice, then once more slowly. This wasn't an apology dressed as opportunity. This was recognition without obligation. I asked for time to consider it. That night, Evan and I met for dinner. We sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant, candles flickering between us. They're moving out of the house, he said, stirring his drink. I nodded. Michigan. Yes, he replied, downsizing, selling. And Claire, he hesitated. She's lost. I didn't ask him to elaborate. I don't feel sorry for her, I said carefully, but I don't feel angry anymore either. He smiled faintly. That's how I knew you were past it. The next message surprised me. It was from my mother. Just one sentence. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. No explanation, no defense. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed back. I wish you had. I hope you learned to protect yourself now. She didn't reply. And that was okay. Because apologies don't need conversation to be real. Sometimes they just need to be acknowledged and released. The following Sunday, I did something I hadn't done in years. Nothing. I walked along the lake. I read a novel. I cooked a meal slowly instead of efficiently. I let silence exist without filling it. And in that silence, I realized something important. I had built my identity around being the one who endured. The reasonable one. The resilient one. The daughter who didn't cause trouble. Even my revenge, quiet as it was, had still been shaped by them. This was the first moment that belonged only to me. On Monday morning, I accepted the board's offer. It came with autonomy, authority, clear expectations, and no family history attached. When I signed the contract, my hand didn't shake. Later that afternoon, I ran into Claire. Not intentionally. She stood at the crosswalk near my office, coat pulled tight, eyes hollow in a way I recognized too well. She saw me and froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the light changed. She stepped forward, I did too. When we were close enough to speak, she stopped. I didn't think it would end like this, she said quietly. I studied her face, not with anger, with clarity. It didn't end, I replied, it changed. She looked away. I don't know who I am without them. I understood that pain more than she knew. You'll figure it out, I said. Or you won't, but it's not my job anymore. She nodded once. We crossed the street in opposite directions. No drama, no closure scene. Just two people moving forward into different lives. That night I packed away the last folder of documents from the case. I labeled the box simply passed. As I slid it onto the shelf, I felt something lift. I hadn't just defended myself. I had dismantled the story that said my worth depended on endurance. That story ends here. And what comes next? That part finally belongs to me. Grief doesn't disappear just because justice arrives. It lingers quietly, changing shape, waiting for moments when your guard is down. I learned that in the weeks after everything settled, when the adrenaline was gone, when the phone stopped buzzing, when there was no longer a problem to solve. I had space, and space I discovered can be terrifying. The new role consumed my mornings in a good way. Different city, different offices, different stakes. I was no longer untangling decades of family dysfunction. I was building systems, mentoring teams, shaping outcomes that didn't carry the emotional weight of childhood wounds. People listened to me without hesitation. They trusted me without testing me first. The first time a junior manager said, "I've been waiting to learn from someone like you," I had to excuse myself to the restroom and sit down until the shaking passed. I wasn't used to being wanted without conditions. Outside of work, I began rebuilding in smaller, quieter ways. I joined a book club full of women who didn't ask about my family unless I volunteered. I took a ceramics class on Wednesday nights and let myself be bad at something without apologizing. I started walking the lake at sunrise, watching the water change colors, reminding myself that time moves forward whether you're ready or not. Slowly, my nervous system learned that peace didn't mean danger. Evan visited often. We talked more honestly than we ever had growing up. About our parents, about the roles we'd been assigned, about the versions of ourselves we'd had to shed to survive. "I always thought you were stronger than me," he admitted one night over takeout. I shook my head. "You left, that took courage?" He smiled sadly. "You stayed, that took endurance." We clinked glasses in quiet recognition. My parents faded into the background of my life. Occasionally, there were updates through Evan. My father's health stabilized, but his pride never fully recovered. My mother started volunteering, perhaps trying to rewrite her own narrative of usefulness and care. They didn't ask to see me. I didn't offer. It wasn't punishment. It was reality. One afternoon, Margaret invited me to lunch. She looked pleased in the way only someone who's seen 100 stories end badly can look when one doesn't. "You did something most people never manage," she said as we sat down. "What's that?" I asked. "You didn't replace one cage with another," she replied. "You didn't become what hurt you." I considered that. There were moments I wanted to, I admitted. She smiled knowingly. "Of course you did. Revenge is seductive because it feels like control. But you chose something harder." "What's that?" "Freedom without applause." That stayed with me. A month later, I received an invitation to speak on a panel about leadership under pressure, women in executive roles, public audience, questions from strangers. The old version of me would have declined, afraid of being seen too clearly. I accepted. Standing on that stage, looking out at faces filled with curiosity and hunger for reassurance, I told the truth. Not about my family, not about the lawsuit. about the cost of silence. I talked about how competence doesn't protect you from being diminished, how loyalty can be weaponized, how walking away doesn't mean failure. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached me. I was the quiet daughter, she said, voice trembling. I thought it was too late to change. I took her hand. It's never too late to stop carrying what hurts you. She cried. I held steady. That night, I went home and sat on my couch, the city glowing outside my windows. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who listened from hallways, who waited for permission, who believed love had to be earned through compliance. She didn't disappear. She integrated. She became the part of me that recognizes injustice quickly, that refuses to minimize harm, that understands how deeply family wounds can shape a life. I don't hate my parents. I don't love them the way I once tried to. I see them, and seeing clearly is its own kind of peace. Sometimes late at night, I still imagine alternate endings, conversations where they chose differently, moments where someone intervened sooner. But then I wake up in my own bed in a life I built deliberately, and the fantasy loses its grip. Because the truth is this: what they did forced me to grow roots somewhere else. And those roots are strong. The fire burned away the illusion. What grew afterward was real. And as I stood by my window watching the city breathe, I knew one final thing. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about becoming someone no one could ever erase again. And that realization was the quietest victory of all. The last time I thought about inheritance, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with distance. I was standing in my kitchen early one morning, coffee cooling on the counter, the city still half asleep. Sunlight crept across the floor in a thin line, touching the edge of the table where I'd spread out papers for a meeting later that day. Ordinary papers. Work that mattered. Work that was mine. That was when it occurred to me that nothing they'd tried to take from me was something I needed anymore. Not the money, not the house, not the company name or the approval that had once felt like oxygen. What I'd inherited instead was something far more durable. Clarity. People talk about karma as if it's dramatic, as if it crashes into your life with thunder and lightning announcing itself loudly so everyone can see who was right and who was wrong. But real karma is quieter. It looks like living well, while the people who built their lives on control slowly realize they don't know how to live without it. I didn't attend the house sale. Evan told me afterward that the rooms looked smaller than he remembered, that the portraits came down easily, that the place felt emptier than it ever had when we were children. I imagined my parents walking through those rooms, touching walls that once echoed with authority and assumption. I wondered if they felt relief or regret. I didn't ask. Closure doesn't require answers from people who never learned how to tell the truth in the first place. The final email came from my father a few weeks later. I won't pretend I handled things well. I see that now. I hope in time you can forgive us. I read it slowly. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a decision you make for someone else's comfort. It was a process you move through at your own pace if and when it serves you. I didn't write back. Not out of spite, out of honesty. Because forgiveness without accountability is just another form of silence, and I had promised myself I would never go back to that. Life moved forward in ways that felt almost anticlimactic. Projects launched. Teams grew. I mentored women who reminded me of my younger self, careful and capable, and unsure why they still felt invisible. When they asked for advice, I didn't tell them to work harder. I told them to take up space. I told them to document everything. I told them that loyalty should never cost you your dignity. Sometimes they looked surprised, sometimes relieved, sometimes scared. I recognized all of it. On my 30th birthday, Evan came over with a small cake and a crooked candle he'd clearly grabbed last minute. We laughed about it sitting on the floor again, backs against the couch. "Do you feel older?" he asked. "No," I said, "I feel truer." He nodded. "That's better." Later that night alone, I thought about the question women like me rarely ask themselves. Who am I when no one is taking from me? The answer wasn't flashy. I was someone who slept well, someone who spoke carefully and acted deliberately, someone who chose relationships based on reciprocity instead of obligation, someone who understood that family can be a source of harm as easily as it can be a source of love, and that it's not disloyal to protect yourself, it's necessary. There are days when the old memories still surface. A holiday song in a store, a particular scent of pine, a father and daughter laughing in public. When that happens, I let the feeling pass through me instead of pushing it away. Grief doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're human. What changed is that I no longer confuse grief with guilt. I didn't fail my family. They failed to see me, and I refused to disappear for their comfort. That refusal reshaped everything. If you're hearing this and something inside you aches with recognition, I want you to know this. Being the quiet one doesn't make you weak. Being patient doesn't make you disposable. And walking away doesn't mean you lost. Sometimes it means you finally stopped letting other people decide your worth. I didn't get the inheritance they planned. I built one they couldn't touch. A life grounded in self-respect. A career shaped by competence, not compliance. A future where I don't have to shrink to belong. That's the ending they never planned for. And if you've ever been excluded, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside by the people who should have protected you, I hope my story reminds you of something important. You are allowed to choose yourself. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through family betrayal, workplace injustice, or the long road of reclaiming your dignity, share your story in the comments. You're not alone, even when it feels that way. And if you want more stories about revenge that turns into justice, about women who stop being silent and start being free, don't forget to like this and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming unerasable.